Alrighty. Let me just, I'm going to mute everybody. If anyone wants to ask questions, just use the chat if you don't mind. That's the best way to do it. That way, all right. Oh, good, Shelley. Good thing. Okay, if you wouldn't mind sending me a copy, I don't have that either. Good. Okay, so we're about to start, and we're not going to start directly first with the actual text of the Sefer Yetzirah yet. That will start hopefully next week. But we are going to start with a basic introduction to the whole subject of learning Kabbalah from a text, and particularly learning Sefer Yetzirah in the current form that we have it. And I'll discuss this a little bit more, what I mean by the current form that we have it, etc. Okay. Most people know of Sefer Yetzirah whenever they hear the word Sefer Yetzirah, so they understand that there's the Sefer Yetzirah was used to create a golem, to create like a sort of a humanoid. I guess this was the forerunner of Frankenstein, probably. Called a golem in Hebrew, spelled Golem in English, or Gimel Vav Lamed Mem, a golem. And there were many instances of creating a golem. In fact, there's a Talmudic passage in Sanhedrin and various other places where the sages actually created these humanoid things, and on occasion the sages actually created on a Friday, they would create a calf. They would create a calf and then they would eat it for the Sabbath. They would create it in honor of the Sabbath and eat it on the Sabbath, and so on and so forth. I don't want to get into the whole thing. It's not really necessary to get into it, but the point being that that's not what we're going to be doing. We're not creating any humanoids or even animal type figures in order to use them or whatever. This is not the purpose. Our purpose is understanding the world that we live in better, understanding ourselves better, and hopefully being able to apply some of the concepts in changing our worldview. And this is a very important thing that I really need to emphasize quite to quite an extensive degree. Well, let's just start with the following. There's a verse, a very, very important verse in the creation of man. This is a verse that occurs early on in Genesis, when it talks about the creation of man. I think it's in the first chapter of Genesis. God creates man, and it says like this. It could be it's the second chapter already, but in any event, this is what it says. I'll just read out the verse, and then I'll explain why we need to understand this verse. Vayitza Hashem Elokim et ha'adam afar min ha'adama. God created man, dust from the earth, from dust of the earth. Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim, and he breathed into his nostrils a breath of life. Vayhi ha'adam lenefesh chaya, and man became he became a living creature. And man became a living creature. In other words, that breathing into his nostrils the breath of life is what made man a living creature. All of the other creatures were not created in the same way. All of the other creatures were just created. They weren't created as inanimate and then the breath of life was breathed into them. They were just created as what they are. The various animals and so on and so forth, and the plants and the even inanimate matter was just created. It wasn't a two-step process, creating an inanimate object and then breathing into it the breath of life. But the interesting point over here is what the Targum is the Aramaic translation. The Aramaic translation, there are actually 3 Aramaic translations of the script of scripture. The most common one and the most famous one is called Targum Onkelos. Onkelos was actually a convert to Judaism, and he wrote a translation in Aramaic where he became one of the great sages of his time, and he actually reveals many very important underlying ideas in the text when he translates them. So his translation isn't just what they would call in Hebrew Targum Miluli, like a word-for-word translation. It's a translation of the idea as well as a translation of the words. In any event, Targum Onkelos renders the words that man was a nefesh chaya, man became a living creature, a nefesh chaya. Targum Onkelos renders this as laruach mamalala, man became a speaking creature. So therefore, the life of man, to a large extent, is bound up with the concept of speech. This is one of the underlying themes of Sefer Yetzirah. It's not a theme that is mentioned explicitly, but it's an underlying theme and one that is actually extremely important. That man, the difference between man and animals is the difference between speaking creatures and creatures that communicate in a very rudimentary form. Man can communicate in a very sophisticated form, as we know. Now, Sefer Yetzirah almost takes this for, I wouldn't say takes it for granted, but does not actually explain this whole idea. And let me just point out another thing in rabbinic literature, especially rabbinic literature of this sort. The Sefer Yetzirah, I'll discuss it in a few minutes, is a very ancient text. One of the most ancient texts that's part of the corpus, which is called the Oral Torah. Originally, the Oral Torah was not written down, it was transferred from teacher to student. And the reason for that was that the teachings could best be shared and imparted not on paper, but by teacher to student. Now, we've discussed it. I know there are various people that are very interested in this subject. Aiden, for example. I don't see that she's on tonight, but in any event, there are people that are very interested in this idea of the communication of the teacher, the transfer of the teachings from teacher to student, and not via books. Now, the original Sefer Yetzirah is said to have been composed by Abraham. In fact, if you look in the last chapter of the Sefer Yetzirah, if everyone has the Sefer Yetzirah book or the PDF that I sent you, if you go to the last chapter, which is chapter 6, there's 6 chapters. If you go to the last chapter of the work, you will see that that's 6:7, right? Chapter 6, Mishnah 7. So it says over there, and when Abraham, our father, may he rest in peace, looked, saw, understood, probed, engraved, carved, he was successful in creation as it is written, and the souls that he made in Haran, and so on and so forth. In other words, the author apparently of the Sefer Yetzirah is Abraham, because he was the one that it says right at the end that it implies that he composed the work. However, the work was not written down in Abraham's time. It was passed down, as I said before, from teacher to student, and eventually it was written down by, at least this is the Jewish tradition, it was written down by Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, the famous sage who lived in the 1st, 2nd century. He was a teacher of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and teacher of the Rashbi, the author of the Zohar. And Rabbi Akiva was the one who wrote the Sefer Yetzirah down. And at that time, a lot of the oral Torah was being written down because it was the time of the Roman occupation, and the sages were very concerned that the tradition should not be lost altogether. Many of the sages had already been put to death; they'd been tortured to death essentially, and the Romans were not exactly friendly towards. They weren't exactly friendly towards the rabbis and towards anyone that considered an enemy of the Roman Empire. And in order to make sure that everyone would be obedient slaves and servants, they put to death a very large number of the rabbis. And fearing that things would be lost, a lot of it was written down. In any event, so the central theme then underlying the Sefer Yetzirah is that this has to do with the speaking voice, the Ruach Mamalala, the speaking soul, the ability of man to speak. Interestingly enough, the golem, whenever there was a golem created, our sages tell us the difference between a human being and a golem. A golem was, again, this humanoid thing that was created by the sages through various ages until actually fairly recently, the time of the Maharal of Prague in the 1500s, he created a golem. There's actually a book, a fanciful book, a story book called The Golem, where it talks about the adventures of the golem of the Maharal of Prague. It's probably, a lot of it is just legend. It's not fact, but apparently the Maharal of Prague did create such a thing to protect the Jewish community of Prague from marauders and invaders and crusaders and all kinds of other, well, not really crusaders, it was after the time of the Crusades, but anyway, to protect the Jewish community. The difference between the golem and a human being is that a golem cannot speak. Even though it was created using the Sefer Yetzirah, nevertheless, they are not able to speak. They were not endowed with a Ruach Mamalala, a speaking soul. They may be alive, they may be functioning, they may be very powerful, but a speaking soul they are not. That can only come from God. Now, why is this important? You will see as we travel through the various chapters of Sefer Yetzirah that the Sefer Yetzirah puts a tremendous emphasis on letter formation, letter permutation. There's formations of letters, and then there's the permutations of the letters, and a lot of Sefer Yetzirah has to do with letter permutations and what they mean and how they work and how they can be changed and how they can be transposed and so on and so forth. We'll get to the structure of the Sefer Yetzirah soon, but this is a very, very important point. Why is this so important? Well, as we said before, prior to the time that the Sefer Yetzirah was written, or was written down, it was transmitted in oral form. Now, approximately up until the time of the Jews in Egypt, which was after the time of Abraham, but up until that time, the only kinds of writing that that existed at that time was basically, there were two kinds of writing actually. There was hieroglyphic writing and cuneiform. Cuneiform is they used some kind of either a reed or a piece of wood or a metal instrument to make markings in clay. But in any event, although cuneiform is somewhat representative, but it nevertheless represents images. Writing hieroglyphics and cuneiform writing up until that time was it was graphic. It transmitted a story in pictures of one sort or another. In other words, the mindset of those who wrote in hieroglyphics was to transmit the picture that they had in their minds to somebody else through this hieroglyphic writing, if you could call it writing. Now, we know from archaeology and much study has been done of this. We know that the ability to write was a very, very prized talent, and only the elite were essentially taught this hieroglyphic form of writing. It was a very elitist kind of thing, and only kings and princes and their ministers were privy to the decoding of the hieroglyphics and possibly even to the writings thereof. What happened, however, sometime with the exodus from Egypt, perhaps even a little bit before that, but with the exodus from Egypt, and then subsequently with the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, on Har Sinai, when the tablets of stone were given to the Jewish people, they were given in writing, but the writing was a different form of writing. It was different. There's a whole discussion of this in the Talmud, in the Gemara and Sanhedrin. But in any event, the concept of an alphabet came about. This was a whole different mindset. Hieroglyphics represented a sight, a vision, a visual image. Hieroglyphics were a teaching, transmission of teaching through the eyes, whereas the alphabet came to be a transmission of teaching through hearing, through an audial method of transmission. The difference that this made is that there are only a certain amount of phonetic sounds that comprise speech. Up until that time, even in the time of the Egyptians, obviously, there was speech. Speech was created with the creation of man. Man was created as the speaking creatures, which I said. But that transmission of speech was, they didn't try and transmit the sounds of the words that we use. They tried to transmit the picture that people have in their minds. That's what hieroglyphics were, and that's what cuneiform was. Along came the alphabet, and the alphabet came to transmit speech the way we speak. So therefore, to a certain extent, you must say that the alphabet was more true to the nature of man, because man was created as a speaking creature. L'ruach mamalala, God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Says the Targum, L'ruach mamalala, became a living creature, a creature who can speak. Life is bound up with speech. And this is why the underlying importance of the Sefer Yetzirah, because it's a book essentially about speech. How do we know that? Because there's actually one of the Mishnahs in Pirkei Avot, in the second chapter, the third Mishnah. The second chapter, the third Mishnah says as follows: 22 letters, foundational letters, are engraved in the voice. Now there was 22 sort of syllables, 22 syllabic, I don't know what they call them in phonetics or whatever, phonetic sounds, and 22 types of sounds. And those are, says the Sefer Yetzirah, kvuot bapeh, they are placed, they are set in the mouth. In other words, writing the alphabet, the 22 letters of the alphabet were representations of sounds that the mouth produces. So this was actually a revolution. It wasn't only a revolution in the ability to quickly write things instead of a very, very elaborate alphabet with a very elaborate system of hieroglyphics, where there were, according to some, at least 450 markings, hieroglyphic markings that a person had to learn. Imagine having to learn that in order to be able to learn how to transmit an idea. 450 markings. In any event, now there were only 22. The 22 sounds that the mouth produces. And there are slight differences, obviously, between one language and another. But the alphabet was a revolution not only in making the alphabet available to because everybody can learn an alphabet. It's only 22 letters. It's much easier to learn, but it was a revolution in the way we think as well. It wasn't just a revolution in dissemination of ideas. It was a revolution in the way we think. Now, there's some very interesting literature on this. I won't bore you with all the literature, but basically there are two types of modern alphabets. Ancient alphabets as well, if the truth be told. When we talk about an alphabet only started with essentially, apparently the Hebrew alphabet was the first real alphabet. Now, as I mentioned before, according to the Rambam and according to the sages, the Torah was actually given in alphabetical form. It was given as letters. The 10 Commandments were given as letters. It's a whole discussion in the Talmud. I don't want to go into it now. It's not really necessary. But the idea is as follows. Consonantal alphabets, the Hebrew alphabet is an alphabet of consonants. It doesn't have any vowels in it. Vowels are an addition. Vowels are written in a different way. They're not written together with the letters. So when you write in the Hebrew alphabet, you write only consonants without any vowels. Greek, for example, Greek was really the first language to be written together with vowels. Now, the difference between consonantal alphabets, of which Hebrew is one and probably the first one, and vowel alphabets like Greek and then Roman and eventually English, is that generally, there may be exceptions, but I don't know of any exceptions, and if there are exceptions, they're extremely rare. Generally, consonantal alphabets are written from right to left, whereas vowel alphabets, or alphabets with the vowels included, are written from left to right. Now, originally the Greeks would write from right to left and left to right, and then right to left and left to right, and became very confusing. And then they just changed and they switched over completely from left to right. They wrote from left to right. Now, why is this important? Because that little change from right to left, left to right, changed the whole way of thinking. When you start off writing, you're writing from right to left, that is essentially a right brain activity. Consonantal alphabets, in order to be able to understand them, since they don't have the vowels written into the words, to be able to understand the consonants, you have to have the context. You can't understand the word on its own. The word on its own doesn't have a possible, it could have several different meanings. For instance, if you take any three letters, or just let's say two letters, let's do it in English just for by way of example. This is the example that's brought in one of the books. If you take the letters H and T, right? No vowels in it. Now it could be written as hat. It could be written as hat. It could be written as hit. It could be written as hit is not really a word, but it could have any of those three meanings: hat, hit, and so on. So, how do you understand the word? You can only understand it in context. Context is a very right brain activity. Context is a right brain activity. In order to be able to understand context, you have to, that's what the right brain does. The right brain is more of a holistic type action of the brain than the left brain. The left brain is very logical and very sequential. There's the right brain thinking and left brain thinking. According to this, there's actually a very interesting article. If anyone wants to read this article, it's actually very, very well worth reading. I will post the article right here in the chat, and you can make a copy of it, of this link, or you can click on the link maybe. And it's well worth reading. It's from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. What happened here? It didn't go. No, it has to go to everyone in the meeting. There we are. Okay, there we go. Okay. Okay, so that he speaks about that quite a lot there. In any event, The left brain thinking, which became to be characterized Greek thinking, the Greeks were the first essential philosophers and scientists. They were really that science. If we talk about science and philosophy, that was a Greek thing. It was almost a Greek invention. There was science before them, but it was more holistic type science, and not the hard analytical, hard-nosed, logical type science, mathematical sciences, if you want, that existed before that. They were much more bound to logical order, logical thought systems, and scientific inquiry, whereas the right brain is not that. So again, the left brain is analytical, it's detached, it's linear, it's logical. It splits things into their components and sees the connection between them from one thing to another in a logical type of form. Whereas the right brain is holistic, it's integrative. The right brain is even intuitive. These are all quotes from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. It is good at recognizing patterns and handling personal relationships, including non-verbal expressions. It plays a big part in emotional intelligence, the right brain, whereas the left brain is cool and collected. It does not get involved in the emotions. So the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body. So when you move your head to the right, when you move your head to the right, in other words, you start off at the beginning of the sentence, you write from left to right, you're moving your head to the right, then you're using the left hemisphere. When you move it to the left, you start off on the right side, move your head towards the left, it's the right hemisphere that comes into play. Now, in an alphabet like English, every word is intelligible and understandable on its own. In an alphabet like Hebrew, you can only understand the word in its context. And therefore, Greece was famous for its science and philosophy, whereas the Torah was much more focused on integration of things, the integrative modes of thinking, bringing things together, the emphasis on personal relationships, and the emphasis on context. Context gives meaning. Now, why is this all so important? This is all extremely important in order to be able to understand how the Sefer Yetzirah operates. It does not operate in the regular logical fashion. It operates according to, there's one author that explains this. He says there's something called step logic and something called block logic. Step logic is when you go one step after the other. In other words, one idea leads to the next idea, leads to the next idea, leads to the next idea, and that is how things work in a step, in a sequence. And if you leave out one of the steps, then the whole thing doesn't work. Whereas that's, in other words, that kind of linear logic. Whereas contextual logic, that's called block logic. Each block sort of stands on its own as a unit. We will find, as we go through the Sefer Yetzirah, that there's certain ideas that can only be understood in this kind of way. They're not a development of a previous idea, but ideas that stand on their own in their context, in a certain context of ideas. Now, this is all very important for understanding the Sefer Yetzirah way of thinking. And hopefully we'll focus on quite a few of these ideas as we go through. Okay, that's an introduction to the way of thinking of the Sefer Yetzirah. The authorship, I think we already discussed that Abraham was the author supposedly of the Sefer Yetzirah. At least that's the way Jewish tradition believes, that he was the author of the Sefer Yetzirah, but it was written down again later on by Rabbi Akiva. And the verse that is quoted right at the end of Sefer Yetzirah is, and it talks about the souls that he made in Haran. The souls that he made in Haran. It says, "Et hanefesh asher asu b'Haran," the souls that Abraham created in Haran. Now, what kind of souls did he create? Abraham created a certain type of consciousness, writing, and this idea of letters changed the consciousness of people and made their ability to understand themselves completely different from what it was before his time. In other words, this was a revolution not only in technology, writing or whatever, but it was also a revolution in thought, in the way we think about things, that we analyze things. Okay, there's a number of, when we get to it, we will see that there's a number of statements in the Zohar explaining this verse, and we will, when we get there, not this verse, this Mishnah rather, which quotes the verse, and we'll discuss that when we get there. It's actually the ending of Sefer Yetzirah. There are some older manuscripts of Sefer Yetzirah that actually begin with the words, "These are the letters of Abraham our father, called Sefer Yetzirah." In other words, this is the book that he composed, called Sefer Yetzirah, even though he didn't write it down at that time. Now, there are various versions of the Sefer Yetzirah. There's a thing called the short version, the long version, the Saadia version, the Arizal version, the Gra version. According to some, the Gra version and the Arizal version are the same version. But in any event, the version that we'll be following is the one that Aryeh Kaplan used, and that's generally regarded as the Arizal's version, the version of the Sefer Yetzirah that was adopted by the Arizal. And again, we're going to be explaining them according to the tenets of the Arizal, and particularly the tenets of later Kabbalists and Hasidic masters. Okay, so there's 6 chapters in Sefer Yetzirah. Again, we're just talking about the structure of Sefer Yetzirah. We don't the shorter version is much more basic, yeah. Would I say that step knowledge is only contextual, not universal knowledge? No, I would say that step knowledge is not so much contextual. It is, it's linear knowledge. It's developmental knowledge, let's put it that way. It develops, it's not universal knowledge, that's correct. I think that block knowledge is much more universal knowledge. It relies on the context in which the block occurs, rather than on a previous statement. It's not linear in nature, it is holistic in nature, to answer that question. Okay, so there's 6 chapters in Sefer Yetzirah. The first chapter essentially deals with the 22 letters and the 10 sfirot and the 4 elements. And we'll discuss all of these as we get into the chapter. The 4 elements, of course, fire, air, water, and earth. So there's 22 letters, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Interestingly enough, the end letters, the letters that come at the end of the word, which there are 5 of those, are not spoken about at all in the Sefer Yetzirah, which lends credence to the idea that is a very ancient work, perhaps from the time of Abraham, because it was Ezra, the famous sage Ezra, who came back from 70 years after the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. He came back and he was the one to rebuild. He rebuilt the Holy Land to a certain extent, and the temple. And he was one of the great sages. He was a prophet, actually, that prophet and a sage who established the end end letters. Certain letters, the 5 letters, when they come at the end of a word, have a different form, and he was the one that introduced them, Ezra. And Ezra was, we're talking about long before the Common Era. This was I don't exactly know the dates, but someone can look it up and they can tell us. So yes, it is accepted that Abraham did teach his family and others during his lifetime. It's transmitted verbally. Yeah, he was the first rabbi. I suppose you could say that. Yes, he was the first. Abraham is regarded as the first Jew. The first, even though the term Jew didn't exist then, he was an Abramite, and obviously things changed when the Torah was given. But the sages tell us that Abraham, from his understanding, fulfilled all of the commandments of the Torah that it was possible to fulfill. He fulfilled them before the Torah was given. He understood divine knowledge and the divine will. And so he figured all these things out. Okay, so the first chapter then is about the 22 letters, not the 27 letters. The 27 letters includes the 5, what they call the 5 female letters, the 5 end letters, which are called Mansapach, Mem, Nun, Tzadik, Pei, and Chaf, Mansapach. And so 22 letters, 10 sefirot, 4 elements. That's the first chapter. The second chapter speaks about the 5 organs of speech, or what they call in Hebrew the motzot hapeh, the 5 organs of expression. In other words, the throat, the palate that's inside your mouth, that's the tongue, the teeth, and the lips, right? And this chapter, the second chapter, deals with each of those and the letter groups, the groups of letters that are associated with each one, with each. So, for example, the sounds that are associated with the lips are b, f, m, p, right? Those are the letters. The letters that come from the garon, from the throat, are ch and r, and various others. And then there's the letters that are pronounced by the teeth, so to speak, which is the talnat, and so on. And we'll see those when we get to them. That's all chapter 2. And therefore, the letter groups, since this is a phonetic structure, the structure of the Hebrew alphabet, again, is a phonetic structure. It's a representation of sound rather than a representation of pictures. So these groups are very important, and especially when we start crossing between one group and another, that actually changes the way the word is said, and it also changes the thought pattern, because the way we speak affects the way the mind thinks. The words we speak, the word patterns, the letter patterns, affect the mind as well, and we will discuss some of that. Then there, chapter 3 talks primarily about what are called the mother letters. The mother letters, in other words, the letters that in a sense give birth to all of the other letters, and these are the 3 letters called Aleph, Mem, and Shin. Those 3 letters, the first letter of the alphabet, the middle letter of the alphabet, Mem, and one of the second to final letter of the alphabet, the Shin. Very important letters called Emesh in Hebrew, or known as the 3 imot, the 3 mothers, 3 mother letters, so to speak. Then the chapter 4 speaks about the 7 double letters. In other words, letters that come with or without a dagesh. The dagesh in Hebrew is a dot in the middle of the letter, and it's pronounced differently if it has a dot. For instance, the letter B in Hebrew, it's called a bet. Right now, if you pronounce it with a dagesh in it, it's a hard sound, bet. If it's pronounced without the dagesh, it's pronounced vet. Bet as opposed to vet. Let me give you another example. The letter P, or a P in Hebrew, a P in English would be the P in Hebrew, but the P is the sound that has a dagesh. It's the letter with a dagesh. It's called a P. Without a dagesh, it's pronounced Fe. Still pronounced with the lips, Fe and P, pronounced with the lips. Fe, so that would be like equivalent of an F and a P. An F and a P are related in Hebrew, not so much in English, although the shape is pretty much related in English. In any event, those are called the 7 double letters. Those letters that take a dagesh, big kefret. That's the 4th chapter. The 5th chapter is the 12 simple, straightforward letters. The 12 simple letters which correspond, the Sefer Yetzirah is going to tell us, correspond to 12 months and correspond to 12 senses. And now this itself is going to be a big subject, the concept of the 12 senses, or the 12 leaders in the body, because the senses are what lead us to one thing or another. So they call the 12 manhigim, or essentially the 12 senses. And why there are 12 senses, in modern Western philosophy, etc., we have only 5 senses, and maybe if you're lucky, a 6th, right? The 6th sense. But in the ancient traditions, there were actually 12 senses. and we will get to those when we get to chapter 5. Chapter 6 has some very abstruse things that I probably won't spend time on some of them. They have to do with astrology and astronomy and things like that, the influence of the planets and the planets associated with the 12 months and so on. The influence of the planets. This is something that I'd rather not dwell on. I will discuss it briefly, but because there is so much misinformation supplied about these kinds of things, I think it's just better to talk about other more important aspects, other things that relate to the number 12, which is the 12 borders of a cube. The 12 borders of a cube, that's the 4 sides, and then the edges as well of the cube count as anyway, the 12 edges of the cube, 12 borders, the 12 it's called Yud Bet Gvulei Alachson. And then finally, time, space, and consciousness. Very, very important concepts, time and space and consciousness, or time, space, and soul. Olam, Shana, Nefesh, as they call it in Hebrew, time, space, and soul, or time, space, and consciousness. And that is another subject that we'll discuss actually throughout, but it's one of the main subjects in chapter 6. It also goes through the 12 limbs of the body and how they correspond to various letters, and they correspond to the various borders of the cube, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's going to be several topics that we're going to look at: 32 paths of wisdom, the Sefirot and the letters, creation with the name of God. We'll be looking at space, time, and soul and how they're related and interrelated, the letters, the alphabet, and their permutations. The cube as opposed to the tree, the cube as opposed to the tree of life is a certain structure, the Sefirot. The cube is a different representation of them. And then the idea of creation using these permutations, although of course we're not going to do any practical exercises. And then there are meditation techniques, which are very important part of the whole equation over there. Just important to point out that the letters of creation, the letters of the alphabet are said to be the building blocks of creation. These were the letters which were used to create the world. In other words, if you have a look in the beginning of Genesis, it speaks about, and God created when God created the world. So it says 9 times, and God said, there shall be, whatever it was, there shall be light, and there was light. There shall be a firmament in the heavens, and there shall be herbs and animals and so on and so forth. All of these, there are called the 10 utterances. These 10 utterances are made with phonetic sounds, but these phonetic sounds are represented by letters, and therefore the letters have certain creative power. And in their permutations, in particular, they have dodecahedron, maybe that's what it is, I don't know, yeah, could be. The permutations by which we could, so to speak, call it the DNA of creation. These permutations of letters that are found in the 10 utterances are, so to speak, the DNA, the inner DNA of creation. And these were in fact used later on. Our sages tell us in the sages of the tractate called Berachot, they tell us that Bezalel was the person who built the tabernacle, the first prototype of the temple. He built the tabernacle using the same techniques, using the same letters, using the same, or at least some of the same permutations to create the tabernacle. In other words, the tabernacle wasn't just made out of wood and animal skins and wool and gold and so on and so forth, metals. It was made primarily, it was made out of words and letters, permutations, divine holy names. That's essentially what it was all about. And that is one of the main subjects of the Sefer Yetzirah. So that's going to be the scope of more or less what we're going to talk about, and the ideas are represented in a very different way, and I hope to highlight how the ideas are represented in a different way than a logical sort of a logical argument or a logical philosophical argument, like let's say from Plato, Aristotle, and then Socrates, Aristotle, etc. They don't present wisdom in that way. They present wisdom in the Sefer Yetzirah, and Jewish thought in general represents wisdom in a much more sort of holistic way, in a much more a much less left brain way and a much more right brain way. In other words, in a much more intuitive way. Part of the understanding of matters has to be intuitive and contextual rather than logical and philosophical. Okay. In addition to that, Ben asked a very good question. He asked, how does learning Sefer Yetzirah fit into our study of Torah, Kabbalah, and Chassidut? That's one of the things that we have to clarify as we go through. The interpretation and the application of Sefer Yetzirah is going to be culled from the works of the Arizal, the works of the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, a contemporary of the Arizal. The Rabbi Moshe Cordovero was actually, you could say that he was the primary collator. He collated all of the teachings of Kabbalah until his time, particularly the teachings from the Zohar, but he includes Sefer Yetzirah as well. And he has a commentary on Sefer Yetzirah. And he collated it into a book called the Paradise Rimonim, the Paradise, the Orchard. He was a somewhat older contemporary of the Arizal. The Arizal came on the scene. The Arizal was sort of, you could say, I suppose, like Einstein was to Newton, so the Arizal was to the Ramak. Newtonian physics is a very important thing. The Ramak Kabbalah is a very important form of Kabbalah, and very systematic and very reasoned and very well explained. Along comes the Arizal and presents a whole new dimension. And then along comes the Baal Shem Tov and presents another whole new dimension. So we're going to try and follow through the explanations of these teachings in Sefer Yetzirah using primarily those thought patterns of the Ramak, the Arizal, the Zohar, the Ramak, the Arizal, and the Baal Shem Tov, and the students of the Baal Shem Tov, obviously the disciples of Baal Shem Tov right through the generations. And we will try not to just leave it as an intellectual exercise, but as something practical in structuring and perhaps you could say restructuring our daily lives. That's the whole concept of tikkun. Tikkun means to rectify, and to rectify our lives so that they're more, obviously I'm not going to do it for you, that's something you have to do for yourself, but we'll head it in that direction. In other words, practical application in terms of life, perhaps life altering, but certainly life ordering patterns of thinking and behavior. So that's our brief, and that's what we're going to try and do. Are there any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Do we know the circumstances in which Abraham taught information in the Sefer Yetzirah? It is remarkable to have this ancient teaching available. Yeah, do we know the circumstances? I'm not sure what you mean by that, but all of the teachings where he transmitted to his son Isaac, and Yitzchak transmitted it to his son Yaakov, Jacob, and Jacob transmitted it to his 12 sons, who were the 12 tribes, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and so on and so forth, and to Joseph, and so it was handed on through the ages to from student to teacher, again, until it came to be written down. When it's written down, it's more sort of formalized. And that's why there's actually several different versions. There are those that say that there are actually 12 versions of the Sefer Yetzirah, one version corresponding to each tribe. In other words, they are slightly different versions. Not all of them are drastically different, but different versions. Each was the corpus of knowledge that was transmitted to this tribe or to that tribe, to one of the different tribes. And when it was all put together in the form that we have it now, so it was boiled down basically to 4 or 5 different forms, as we mentioned. Are there any restrictions on learning Sefer Yetzirah? Well, the restrictions are on using the practical letter formations without the proper training and without the proper intentions. But we're not going to do that, and I'm not going to teach you how to use them. In any event, we're going to get more towards the consciousness aspect of things, so that in other words, the ideas and the consciousness and how to appreciate the ideas of the Sefer Yetzirah, so that you can do what's necessary to rectify your own life and to change your own perspectives and your ways of looking at things and so on and so forth. Again, this is not something I'm going to do for you. I will just present you with the possibilities, and this is something that people will do if they feel it's right for themselves and so on. But again, it's not, there's not brainwashing of any sort. I'm just going to present ideas, and these ideas could be life-changing. Hopefully they will be for some of you in a positive way, and they will be certainly, I'm hoping that they'll be very, very interesting, because the Sefer Yetzirah is a very fascinating approach to ideas and to understanding things. Okay. You've not heard of the 3 mothers before. Aleph Mem Shin, do indeed feel like 3 mothers. Now that you mention it, I can't really explain why it feels like that. Guess we will have to wait and see. Yes. Yeah. So I hope that answers the question. If there's any restrictions on learning Sefer Yetzirah, again, there's always been a fear amongst people to learn things that were always kept in the restricted column of teachings. In other words, you had to have a certain level of knowledge, and you had to have a certain level of piety and a certain level of holiness to be able to approach these teachings. But since the time of the Baal Shem Tov, these things have changed. In fact, since the time of the Arizal, the Arizal definitely changed the way of thinking. And from the Baal Shem Tov and onwards, it was changed drastically. And to the contrary, one of the ideas, which actually I'm writing a Hebrew commentary on Sefer Yetzirah. One of these days it'll be published. It's still in the future. I've only done 2 chapters so far, but part of the introduction is discussing this idea. What about keeping these things restricted? One of the answers that the Arizal gives, and is given in several places, several different ways, is that a person is obligated to learn the entire Torah. If there's something that you didn't learn now, you won't be able to learn it in the future. In other words, in the idyllic life of the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden. In other words, when the soul leaves the body, it leaves with the knowledge it has, and the knowledge that it doesn't have, it will not be able to take with it, obviously, and it won't be taught that knowledge at that point in time until much later, until Tchiyat HaMeitim, until the resurrection of the dead. In any event, so there is good reason to learn it. How many sessions will we have on Sefer Yetzirah? I would imagine it'll be more or less a Mishnah a week, one of the teachings a week. On some occasions, when the teachings are much shorter, we might even do 2 or 3 in a week. But we're going to be going for quite a while. This is going to be probably a year-long project, I imagine. Some of you saying, "Oy vey, what did I just get myself into?" No one's obligated to come. You can drop out at any time. There's no there's no obligation. If you find it interesting, continue. If you don't find it interesting, look for something else. There is, as I've said before, all my classes are free. I do not charge, but I do appreciate when people donate. There is a donation button, which I don't even know if I have available right now. Let me see. I could probably find it if anyone wants to know. Again, donations are not obligatory. They're just appreciated. Let's put it that way. So I did ask if if people could do a voluntary monthly subscription. Again, it's only voluntary and it's not required. You can come to the class at any time. You can go through an entire year of classes and not pay anything. It's completely up to you. Let me just post this, and here we go for those of you who are interested. And it's it's a charitable organization called Ravanut NFP, not for profit, and that is the PayPal link if you want to donate. When you donate, hit the submit button and not the request button, because I've had a few people who do that, and then it turns up as a bill that I'm supposed to pay somebody else. So if you could do that. Okay, so if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yal asked if there's a reliable English translation of Pardes Rimonim. I don't believe that there's a good English translation of Pardes Rimonim. There might be an old one. I'm not sure. I'll have to look into it. Kitvei Ari, certainly the Kitvei Ari, there is a book called Apples from the Orchard, which was done by a very good friend of mine. In fact, I could say probably one of my best friends, a person named Moshe Vishnevsky, completely reliable, absolutely delightful book. It's called Apples from the Orchard, the teachings of Arizal. But just by the way, I will also be doing a few subject matter classes on the standard work of the Arizal, which is actually not Eitz Chaim, but Otzrot Chaim. It's called Otzrot Chaim. The difference between Eitz Chaim and Otzrot Chaim is that Eitz Chaim has the various versions all put together as one version. In other words, it says Madura Tinyana, Madura, first version, the second version, Madura Kama, Madura Tinyana, the early version, the later version, and it makes for somewhat more of a disorganized work. It's sometimes difficult to follow what's going on. That's in Eitz Chaim. It is the magnum opus, but a later version of Eitz Chaim and a shorter, somewhat abbreviated version and a more organized version is called Otzrot Chaim. I will be giving probably pre-recorded classes. I don't think there will be classes, live classes, but I will be doing some and pasting and posting them on YouTube on the Otzrot Chaim channel. I hope that I figured out how to use playlists to list the classes in Sefer Yetzirah. I think they're called playlists, and I think that will do the trick. So we'll put this in the Sefer Yetzirah playlist. It'll be up after the class, and there you go. Yeah, Apples from the Orchard is a very, very nice book. Very nice introduction. Pick up the link to Rabbi Sachs information about different sides of the brain. I will post it again. I did post it, but I can post it again. Let's see where it is. Here we are. I will post it again. Here is the link to Rabbi Sachs's. You should copy and paste it now, or just click on it and open up a document now, because otherwise, I think the chat is not recorded, if I'm not mistaken. In any event, This is our introduction to Sefer Yetzirah. We will be continuing, and we'll start off next time with the first Mishnah. Oh, thank you very much, Paula. Alrighty. See you all next week. Thank you, Andy. Okay. I just would like to mention now that I will be going away at a certain point in time, and there won't be class when I'm going away.